Howdy of you delicious people, I'm here today to review Sobin's VR Troopers. You know what? Going into this review, I was I was stressing thinking about it, because when going into this, I'm like, you know what? It's easy to probably make fun of this show. It is. I know that there's some people that have done it in the past, and I thought it was funny. And I saw the JonTron video that he did about VR Troopers, not saying that that cemented me to ultimately do this review. I'd also heard a interview that Jason David Frank did, mentioning that he had done the pre-pilot of the show, like the pilot that makes it before the actual show goes to air. And I thought that that was really interesting. I'm like, so, were they going to have him do both? Were they gonna have him just transition onto eventually being on VR Troopers? I'm curious. But yeah, luckily everything turned out well for Jason David Frank, and I think really this show comes down to feeling like a prototype, kind of like how Japanese Spider-Man was. I think Sobin's VR Troopers felt like a prototype. It feels like they were trying to take a lot of risks to see what could pay off. So we have a main character who is named Ryan Steele. We have a female character named Caitlin, and we have a character also called JB. We also have a villain called Grimlord, who ultimately normally would say the same phrase over and over again. Uh, Powers of darkness empower me, take me back to my virtual reality. I probably at some point said something wrong there. I was trying to remember this speech, even though repetitiously it comes up quite a lot. I actually liked Grimlord. Overall, the visual of him consistently being like a businessman and then switching to this medieval almost. I would call him maybe like a gray skull, quite possibly. As if I know about Gray Skull and He-Man and everything like that, because I don't. But because ultimately I just saw a Dolph Lundgren He-Man movie once, but that doesn't mean anything. So we have Grimlock, who is just kind of sitting on his throne and just having a just thrust of just or a trussle or many of people, many of evil minion Esh-like characters, all just sitting around or standing around, all just going, yeah, we're gonna win. Basically, Grimlock is looking at the plenty of villainous characters and already relishing in the fight that he's already won. That's kind of that's what kind of feels like the visual to me, is just this character is just yeah, I've already won this war. Funny enough, there's some, or not funny enough, but on my side, bizarrely, I went into this show and there was actually some things that clicked to me and I did not realize would click when watching this. There were two villains in one episode that were called Slice and Dice, which I'm like, dude, I say that all the time. I was like, Slice and Dice. It was always a funny thing for me to say. And so when going into that, I was like, yeah. I'm like, there's some things here that are kind of bizarrely like that fit my fancy, and some of it kind of might feel honestly like some attempts at doing some like Star Wars-ish like stuff. But I'm also going into this knowing that these same people, this was like a prototype season for everything. Like to ultimately see the the characters. Like I liked the morphing sequence where you have just normal face and then eventually the mask eventually phases in. I thought that that was actually pretty cool. A pretty cool visual, and I thought that that was really interesting. I really liked Caitlyn's boss, who ultimately consistently pops in and is having to consistently per every episode be having some interesting persona, because you know what, this guy may have wanted to just maybe fill up his portfolio, or maybe for him it was just he wanted to do something fun, and here this was. Now, when going into this, we also have the characters eventually going into what would be equivalently called a command center or a laboratory. We ultimately have all three of these characters all go into this, let's just say, laboratory, and is consistently met by a professor. I'm kind of, I'm kind of a little. I was kind of trying to figure out when they kept going to the professor, like the camera angles, the camera angles of the, like they were sometimes a little bit too close to the face, but maybe it was just them like testing angles out to ultimately see how it was going to come out on the show. Maybe there was a lot of like, again, I think they wanted to maybe try to make this character look quasi like the professor character, quasi look like Zordon, like to where you can really see his face on this screen. And like, you know what, like there were some interesting moments to see those kind of adjustments of camera when they kept popping to the professor. There were some interesting attempts on making quasi like Zords, if you want to go into that. Like there was a flying car at one moment. There was a some interesting approaches of like kind of Star Wars like uh, battleships that would come in on certain episodes. The one thing that honestly kind of confused me is the moments when they would switch from being in one battle to, I guess, the virtual reality battle, when like every single one of the three main characters' costumes would drastically change. And then like there was one, like I think Ryan's suit ultimately looked exactly like, well, the helmet looked like, I don't know about the rest of the body, but well, quasi ballparkingly. Like that helmet and that suit all looked just like what was to be Jason's suit from the first episode, or from Mighty Morphin America, or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers America. Why do I have to mention America? It's because ultimately you have like Super Sentai and stuff like that. Like it's me ultimately going and talking about the Masked Rider and Carmen Rider. I think when going into that, it's just like just. Anyways, so that was kind of my confusion, like the thrusting between two different kinds of battles at some point. I did like that Ryan Steele had that dual like lightsaber esh like blade, because like I like that kind of weaponry. Like ultimately, if I were to play a Star Wars game, like I would probably play with like a dual lightsaber, because even though that's probably heavily dangerous, it just looks cool. Uh, there's some stuff that I think just needs to look cool. So we have Ryan Steele kind of narrating to us, and this kind of pops up like a Doogie Howser like moment. Like in the very beginning of this and the very end of this, like he always narrates like his journey. And there are some times where I can feel like this is a prototype for another Power Rangers like season. If anybody knows also Power Rangers Samurai, like ultimately, I feel like this season a lot kind of feels like that in a lot of ways. We we have in here Caitlin's hilarious or funny boss. There's the pilot episode where ultimately we're having Caitlin's boss that is like talking over the phone about a big scoop, and he's like, "What? Where? When? Why? What?" And I was like, "Yes, that's basically me. That's pretty much like normally anytime I would do a video, I'd be like, "What? Where? Why? When?" Because I would just be goofy like that. And there are plenty of times where this guy completely, Caitlin's boss, changes from different personas, different, like, he'll wear like a Russian hat, and he'll just be spouting out some stuff within these episodes. It's fun. Like ultimately, I hope that the guy like had fun doing that character. So now we are led to talking about the dog that is in this show. Really, when looking at it, there is a black and white show that ultimately has a talking horse named Wilbur. When looking at it, seeing the movie Dr. Dolittle, hearing that one of the mental patients was mentioning how they would put peanut butter into Wilbur's gums so that way he would talk. Kind of curious how they did that with this dog. Maybe they were probably just like consistently giving him food. Like, man, like eventually the dog like people were joking. I think there was somewhere that I saw like an outtake about this, that like the dog had gotten like really fat or whatever from eating all the stuff, which is like probably it's probably the only way they could get the dog to talk. It's not that like they have CGI now, because when looking at it, like Power Rangers Ninja Storm, I will admit this, that there was a talking guinea pig or there was a talking hamster that I made fun of. I made fun of because I didn't understand it, and when looking back on that, maybe that was just somebody's fun creation that day. And the show just went with it. Because ultimately they were trying to appeal to a young audience. And so when looking at me like praising the risk of a seemingly talking dog, like I would also have to like just say, hey, like for this talking guinea pig or this talking hamster, like bravo for a person that attempted that and it worked out. because there's a lot of stuff when looking at it, when seeing Scott Bakula from Quantum Leap. He had to do a ton of pilot shows before he even got to finally be on Quantum Leap. He did a ton of pilot shows that sadly enough went nowhere. But then eventually he got to be on Quantum Leap, and then eventually that blew up. That went really well for him. So we have it in here that there are some funny moments. We have ultimately JB's father, who is kind of just driving around in a book mobile thing, handing out books to young kids, and ultimately having a shirt that says "Reading is very cool," and I was like, you know what? Like, you can probably laugh at that. You could. It's easy, but that's the thing. It's easy to laugh at because ultimately it's just people were trying to just like, well, I didn't want to. I was trying to figure out what to do that day. So reading is very cool. Maybe that was a catchphrase during that time. Maybe that was a slogan or saying or some interesting thing that they were doing. But but funny enough, you have like Grimlock, who is going and like, well, I gotta take all those books. I gotta destroy all those books. And there was also like a moment of them also being concerned about trees. Like there was a whole entire episode like dedicated to like trees, which I thought was okay. So when going on in here, we also have the journey of Ryan reflecting back on his father and that he had lost his father. And we have it to where in the first pilot episode, when the characters put on the VR headsets and they go into the virtual reality, like there was a lot of like jiving and stuff like that, which again kind of it you could laugh at, but like hey, like looking at it now, how VR has just really exploded. Like maybe this show at some point was quasi at an attempt of being ahead of its time, but you know, because I know there might have been some early 90s like I think Nintendo had an early 90s VR set that went out. Like I think there are some like rough draft VR stuff out there. And so reason me, I think VR eventually, I think at some point I did have a like a VR like setup of sorts for like a video game where it's just kind of kind of like dots and like you could it was mostly just like a complete black screen, and then you just see like these red little dots, and you would just kind of have to like tilt your head to like hit some dots and stuff like that. So going into this, anyways, we have these VR troopers going and doing like karate tournaments and then being taught at a dojo. I'm like, so why was there so much focus on the karate part in this movie or this show, like it felt kind of like kung fu. If you guys remember that show Kung Fu, like it kind of felt like the karate part was such a vital part to where ultimately, like, for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, like I think they definitely consistently go and like teach people, or they try and have people learn things, but it's like it's mostly just like a community center, and it's a like YMCA like environment where they kind of just teach all kinds of things like dancing and stuff like that. You could see like Kimberly in one episode like training a bunch of people to dance. You could see, of course, Zach training a bunch of kids at one point to do his, I think, keto. You could have Billy at some point learning to dance with a girl, and then eventually like Billy like goes from like maybe not so quite so good to just being like amazing, and then everybody like yeah. So within here, like this also like it kind of feels like a little bit of kung fu, but it also kind of feels like a Chuck Norris kind of thing where everything is like taken like really seriously, which is okay for the fight scenes and the karate tournaments and stuff like that. And then like the breaking of it is Caitlin's boss, or the maybe the dog, or and eventually have the dog eventually turn into a monster in this show, which I was like, okay, that's a interesting risk. Like you already have the voice actor for the dog, so why not have the dog eventually become this like big huge monster, which I thought was interesting because when the dog becomes a monster, there's another monster that appears, and like I believe the dog's name is Jeb. And I could be wrong about this. So Jeb eventually goes and has it to where he has it to where makes the other monster uncomfortable, and then funny enough they kind of duke it out, and Jeb ultimately gets, let's just say, taken down into being the normal dog again. But I'm like, you know what? Like I don't like that they had the dog kind of like whipped creamed or whatever. But funny enough, in the early episodes, there was one episode where the dog was like popping popcorn in the little laboratory, and like the professor was watching him, just like, dude, you've wrecked all over my laboratory because like the dog had like sprayed popcorn everywhere. Interestingly enough, so we have consistent times where Ryan is narrating, and the whole entire time he is practicing karate steps with his dad. And like I was wondering at certain times if they were getting the same doubles every time, or maybe they were getting different looking people at some points, which is perfectly fine because on shows they'll always tell you that it's difficult to like schedule like animals and kids and stuff like that, so it's understandable that they can't get the same actor or actress every time. Funny enough, I had just seen The Mandalorian. I know that's going to be a random interjection here, but I was actually really surprised to see the and this is going to timeline exactly when this video comes out. Like I just saw The Mandalorian and I saw Battlestar Galactica's the girl from Riddick and Battlestar Galactica. She was in there, and then ultimately I saw Sasha Banks. All right, that's great. It's pretty awesome. Uh, kind of like kind of a like I wish there was like I wish there could have been like I was kind of figuring out like I'm hoping there's more to this episode, and of course there was kind of like a to be continued kind of thing to it. Like I'm hoping like I was like, man, like you gotta like they kind of got you, and like now you're hooked. Like they're gonna do like maybe a to be continued for every like well of course this is a series, but like kind of like leave you wanting more, which is okay. I think the later that we kind of gone into this series, the longer that we got onto the later episodes, the longer that it kind of felt like you've kind of seen everything with this show, sadly enough. But it was interesting to know that like they already have like a second season for this, and so I was kind of like, okay, well, how do they get this to go so far? You have like old fashioned like cartoons that are like Captain Planets or like or when like Power Rangers Megaforce, that's not old, but they went to like Defenders of the Earth, which ultimately I remember somewhere there was like this old cartoon called Defenders of the Earth where they had like the Phantom in there. If you guys remember the Billy Zane movie, The Phantom, which ultimately eventually got adapted into. Where am I going with all these? like, like these kind of like this honestly shouldn't have been called like VR Troopers. It should have been called like Defenders of the Earth or, um, because I don't know if the VR element is understood enough or it's you can grasp it fully. Because again, Grimlock kind of has his world, and then there's monsters that come to from his world to this world, and man, were those monsters kind of cool. I could see where there were some monsters that were taken. I'm like, oh, I can see prototypes for so many other monsters. Like there was one monster that had this like weapon on his arm, and I was like, maybe that is a prototype for what they did with uh, Rita's brother, where he has the cannon out of his arm. It was also interesting to see the like there's certain kind of like rocket-ish like monsters. So I'm like, okay, how do they do those? Like, was it netting? Was it just that they like it had to have been netting. Like I don't think that they actually like had like a buttoned source like thing that they like air pumped out of those things. That would be interesting, but of course you couldn't show like it hitting anywhere because reasonably like I'm sure those things would have just landed wherever. And and you would have had to have like watched somebody get hit with them later, which I think that's what happens on the show. So we have these like interesting robot-ish like characters. If anything, to me, like a lot of these characters much more remind me of Transformers than actual like Power Rangers villains. Yeah, people could combat that because ultimately there's a lot of eventual later seasons where you have like a much more like consistent machine like monster come in, but like I don't think that that really happens right away. I think when going into like Mighty Morphin, it seems like they went with the more monster-ish like appeal. They went for some more like fairy tale-ish like characters, where in this show it's much more robotic and it's much more so like it kind of feels again to me like I wonder where that comes from, where the villain always just has to sit on a throne. Is that just a villainish thing to do? I never really quite understood where that comes from. Like I guess like a person like because we had Zed do it, we had Lord Zed do it, we had this Grimlock do it, and basically for a bulk of the time that's like from 15 episodes that's all I've seen him do. Like it would be cool to actually see him like actually go out there and fight any of the VR troopers. It would have been great. Because ultimately, like, eventually Skeletor at least, like, gets out of his chair and has to really grab somebody or has to intimidate someone or has to tell somebody that they thought they were going to be He-Man. Ghostbusters 2 reference. Um, so we have we have to where it's about the point of conclusion within this review. Like normally I'd probably go on to reviews for like an hour or something like that, but for this one it's just like VR troopers are kind of goofy, but you know what? I can forgive them for that. I can because again, it's a prototype show. There are a lot of like I guess this would have been 1992, and I might be wrong about that. So when looking at this, I think that this movie kind of reflects a lot of the 90s or like 80s like action movies. I think that's kind of where they were going with here. Like, if you guys remember stuff like Kickboxer and a lot of uh, John Claude Van Damme like stuff like that. That's what this kind of like. God, there was a guy that ultimately did the show Step by Step. Ultimately, God, there's he kind of like stepped in and did some like kickboxer ish like uh stuff. Ultimately, when like ballparking around the same time that John Claude Van Damme was doing like his like kickboxer and stuff like that, I think he eventually did like movies like that. And I think maybe like I'm getting down to a point where it's like, what is he even talking about? I don't even remember any of these things. It's okay. It's all right. So we have, interestingly enough, I think Caitlin has a very interesting persona. going on here, because ultimately she not only is a crime fighter by day, but then she's also like taking photos of a scoop by night. Recently, there are some times where there was one episode where people lost their memory, and like she had to try to help them. She had to try to help one person find their way back to their family. There was also consistent times where Caitlin was at work and then eventually would just like stumble upon a story. Interestingly enough, when I talked about Power Rangers Megaforce, like I mentioned, like, man, it would have been good if there was some kind of like newspaper or like portfolio making paparazzi. I'm trying to think of the word. If you guys remember the David Spade show, just shoot me. The photographer. There we go. Like I kind of wanted there to be like a reason why uh, Christina's character that ultimately plays the Pink Ranger on that show. Like I was kind of wondering why she would take so many photos. And I think like if they would have went with this journey in this from this show to that, I think you could have made a lot of sense of that. Really, I know that kind of when looking at this, like a news reporter kind of thing has like Spider Man or like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles like vibes, but justifiably it's not like we're having Caitlin that is just gonna go, oh well, I have this scoop on these VR troopers, and like that would be an interesting show. Like we even at one point in time have uh, the Rangers turn evil, or the troopers turn evil and turn against one another, which that always is a always like I don't want to say gimmick, but it's always a thing that they always do. And I wish that there was always a better setup of that. To ultimately, you could really love those episodes and really have it to like within that same episode, you can invest in the person that turns evil to where when they turn evil, you're like, oh no, like he was having such a good story arc and then turned evil and then like did some horrific like stuff. Like I wish that there would have been a build to the whole turn evil thing. They usually just kind of like toss it in there, and I wish that that didn't happen. So we have Ryan Steele, who in the very beginning of this, like the very first episode, we're just having Ryan Steele just kind of sitting down or just kind of laying down, and he can't do anything. Which I'm kind of like, okay, like were they again trying to see, interestingly enough, if a person just kind of lays down and does nothing, if people would be interested in that moment via TV ratings, or would it drop off? Because at some points you see the Power Rangers in their show, eventually they fall and they spark. They eventually like flip and fall. There's a lot of times where they kind of do like crazy like cartwheel esh like falls and all these like really really kind of like gymnastic approaches, which ultimately, when looking at Power Rangers, that's the one thing where I'm like, whew, I'm like, man, like especially like comparing that to like the people that work at like pro wrestling and stuff like that. Normally, they would have to do these routines, these like mat routines that ultimately be would basically be like all these like flipping techniques and and stuff like that. And I would just be in awe about that. It's like, man, like I wonder how much practice that took, like to get it, because I know there's sometimes where like you'll have like William Regal that would ultimately tell people to how to do things right. And I don't know, I'm going into wrestling, but let's taper back. So going into this, VR Troopers is at least in a like there's some portions of it where I thought it was visually interesting. I thought there was some investigational measures which I thought were kind of some interesting things going on where the two other characters would end up like planning a bomb and would have to like they would have like somebody had to like it's not just like a normal bomb like Batman 66 where like Adam West is like crazily running with a bomb all over the town or anything. No, it's just like a bomb that it looked like very sci-fi-ish, and they like slapped in some part of the building and then they just kind of ran out. uh yeah, it would have been interesting to have this be if you could really understand the virtual reality part. Like it would have been interesting if there would have been consistent times where the fight would have been right up next to Grimlock. Like that the VR troopers would have just battled through into the virtual reality temple or whatever that these villains were all sitting on a throne around. And like it would have been cool if they could have like just battle all through all those minions, like the slices and dices and all those other interesting and or odd like there was just a sprawl. I want to know how much time all those guys in those suits, how much did all that take to put on? I'm sure, yeah, when looking at it, it's like, well, there was like X and number of people, everybody had their own suit. Yeah, I get it. So everybody was probably simultaneously all putting their suits on all at the same time, but like, man, you would had to have think like, who were the people helping them put those on? Like, was it two people, three people? Like, man, there was just a ton of bodies that probably were helping put like 50 people in a suit, maybe. Seemingly, I don't know. There could have been less, there could have been more. But again, like, I'm probably getting to the point of just uh, going past that where it's, where like, yeah, you're really stretching this review. I'm just kind of tailoring back around to some episodes. And so I think that's all that I wanted to say about this, and I apologize if I didn't get like maybe I didn't go into a spoiler version. I thought I did, maybe I didn't. Uh, well, spoilers if I didn't say so. But recently there are some visually interesting things going on, but when looking at it, I think a lot of this story was tailoring back on like some things of that time, like even probably Karate Kid, which I'm not exactly sure exactly when that went on because I didn't I didn't check that out. maybe let's pause right here and I'll find exactly when the first Karate Kid movie came out. Interesting enough, 1984. So yeah, kind of feels a little bit like Karate Kid, and I think this came out in 92. So yeah, I think that might have been like some kind of things taking from that. And also, we have, oh God, what was I going with? Karate Kid. Oh, Cobra Kai. I actually like that show. It's now on Netflix. Go ahead and check that out. But yeah, I'm going to get out of here. I didn't know I was gonna spend like I knew I was gonna spend, but then like in the end of like 45 minutes. Oof. I don't know. VR Troopers, but like really, I've just not been 100% positive about every Sabin like thing. So when going into this, I I wanna try to figure out that there are some good points. Even if it is kind of like, yeah, I'm not quite sure that this, because eventually it's tailored, like eventually Power Rangers and Sob and stuff are all tailored to a certain audience, and but they also created Jay and Silent Bob reboot. So ultimately, there's a whole scene in the court scene where they're talking about the Red Ranger. It's like, yeah, the Red Ranger. I like the Gold Ranger. It's like, or I liked him when he came back and he was a Gold Ranger, and you just have like Kevin Smith just going throughout the whole movie, and I thought that was really fun. Like that. I like that whole funny moment. Like I will always taper back to that, and like, man, like that movie was actually really fun, and I hope Kevin Smith eventually at some point makes another one of those bad boys. From what I've heard, he's going and doing Mallrats. He's gonna do another Mallrats. I'm like, yeah. I ultimately know that that also we are hopefully going to be getting another Power Rangers movie. Kind of like I think everybody's on the fence. Everyone's hoping. Everybody's wanting. Everybody's just like, man, if that CGI part is really good. Because ultimately, when looking at this, like the VR moments when ultimately Ryan is talking to his father and they're having this like tender, sweet moment. Like, yeah, it's kind of like you can't always exactly tell what's going on, but that's like perfectly fine because it's still trying to get you to invest in Ryan Steele because I think overall Ryan Steele is kind of the focus, but like I wanted to like go in and look at like hey, well what else is going on? Like Caitlin looks interesting. Like JB is kind of a character that I'm wanting to see what they do with his character. I'm wanting to see what they do with him, and I hope that eventually happens. So I'm gonna get out of here. I'm 49 minutes, so I'm gonna get out. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.